Tonight, I want to talk to you plainly about the case of Dusty Ray Spencer. I want to begin with every every honest conversation about a death penalty case has to begin with the victim. Karen Spencer was killed. She was murdered. Her life mattered. Her fear mattered. Her suffering mattered. Her loved ones, her family, have carried that loss for more than 3 decades. Nothing I say tonight is meant to erase her, minimize her death, or pretend that violence does not leave wounds that never fully close. But acknowledging the reality of a crime does not require us to surrender our moral judgment. It does not require us to accept every punishment the state chooses to impose. And it certainly does not require us to stay silent when the government prepares to execute a man under a death sentence that was never produced by a unanimous jury. And at resentencing was produced with no jury at all. That is the heart of this case. The state of Florida is preparing to execute Dusty Ray Spencer, a 74-year-old man who has spent more than half of his life on death row. He was 40 years old when Karen Spencer was killed. He killed his wife. He's now an elderly man, worn down by age, illness, confinement, and 34 years under a sentence of death. But this case is not only about age. It's not solely about it's an old man. It's not only about time. It is about whether the state should be allowed to carry out the ultimate punishment when the foundation beneath that punishment has cracked. The original jury that heard the penalty evidence in Dusty Spencer's case recommended a date by a vote of 7-5. Death, 7-5. That means that 5 jurors, nearly half the jury, did not believe death was the appropriate sentence. 5 human beings sat through the evidence, listened to the aggravation, listened to the mitigation, and concluded that Dusty Spencer should live. That was not unanimity. That was not moral certainty. That was not the kind of reliability that we should demand before the state kills a person in our name. And it gets worse. When the Florida Supreme Court later came back and vacated Spencer's original death sentence and sent the case back, he did not receive a new penalty phase before a new jury. No new jury heard the case. No new jury weighed the aggravating evidence against the mitigating evidence. No new jury made the life or death decision. Instead, the original trial judge resentenced him to death. Let that sink in. Dusty Spencer was never sentenced to death by a unanimous jury. And when his death sentence was revisited, he faced no jury at all. Now that should trouble every single person who believes in the Constitution. It should trouble every person who believes that death is different. It should trouble everyone who believes that when the government takes a life, the process must be more than technically legal. It must be a trustworthy verdict. Years later, in Hearst versus Florida, the United States Supreme Court said clearly what should have been clear all along. In a capital case, a jury, not a judge, a jury must make the critical findings necessary to impose death. A jury's recommendation is not enough. A judge's independent finding is not enough. The Constitution requires the jury. And in Dusty Spencer's case, the problem is not abstract. It is not academic. It is not some harmless legal technicality. Florida's own Supreme Court has recognized the gravity of the problem. A justice of that court, the Florida Supreme Court, described Spencer's case as involving the quintessential Hearst error. A man sentenced to death without the jury determination guaranteed by the United States and Florida Constitution. Think about that phrase, quintessential Hearst error. That means this is not a marginal case. This is not a minor procedural complaint. This is the very kind of case that exposes what was wrong with Florida's old death penalty system. Yet Dusty Spencer was denied relief. Why? Not because the constitutional problem was less real in his case, not because his jury was unanimous, not because a jury resentenced him, not because the defect magically disappeared. He was denied relief because of timing, because his case became final before the cutoff date. That is the kind of legal answer that might satisfy a courtroom calendar, but it should not satisfy the human conscience. It should not satisfy your conscience. A constitutional violation does not become reliable because the paperwork got old. And a man should not be executed because he landed on the wrong side of a retroactivity line. If the Constitution means what the courts now say that it means, then Dusty Spencer should not die under a sentence that no court, not a single court, would defend as reliable today. That's the legal and constitutional problem. But there is another question we have to ask. Who is the state executing? Well, the state's not executing the 40-year-old man who committed this crime in 1992. The state is executing a 74-year-old man who has lived more than 3 decades in prison without access to alcohol, without freedom, without the circumstances that surrounded the original offense, and under the complete control of the state. The mitigating evidence in Spencer's case was not imaginary. It was not invented. It was not printed on a printing press and sent out. It's not something soft-hearted people added later to excuse the inexcusable. The courts themselves recognized serious mitigation, chronic alcohol abuse, mental and emotional impairment, traumatic background, sexual abuse as a child, honorable military service, employment history, and the ability to function in a structured environment. That all matters. It matters because mitigation is not an excuse. Mitigation is context. It is the law's way of saying before we decide whether a person should live or die, we must look at the whole person, not just the worst act of that person's life. And if those mitigating factors were real then, they're even more important now. Dusty Spencer has aged. He's been sober for decades. He's lived in a structured prison environment for more than 34 years. He has passed from middle age into old age. The emotional volatility, alcohol abuse, and domestic crisis that experts identified as part of the pathway to this violence are not the same realities today. People change. I know they change. I have changed. I'm not the same person that I was in 1974. And I'm a veteran. Dusty Spencer is a veteran. I served in Vietnam. I came back with traumatic PTSD. In fact, now it's complex PTSD. But people change. Some people change because they choose to. Some change because time breaks them down. Some change because prison strips away the conditions that once fueled their worst behavior. Some change because age changes the body, the mind, the emotions, and the capacity for violence. But whatever the reason, change matters. Here's the thing, the state knows this. The science of criminology knows this. Every serious student of incarceration knows this. Elderly incarcerated people are among the lowest risk population in the entire prison system. Violence declines with age. Recidivism declines with age. The public safety argument becomes weaker and weaker as a person grows old behind bars. So let's be honest here. There's not a public safety argument for this execution. Dusty Spencer is not going to walk out of prison. He's not going to miraculously return to society. He's not a threat to the public. Life imprisonment until natural death would incapacitate him completely. So what purpose is served by killing him now? Not public safety, not rehabilitation, not deterrence in any meaningful sense of the word. What remains? The only thing that remains is retribution, revenge. Retribution is not a small thing. I understand that. When someone has been murdered, when a family has been shattered, when terror and grief have entered a home, the cry for punishment is real. The desire for consequences is real. But retribution cannot be the only word in a civilized society's vocabulary. Cannot be the only word. If the only question is, did he do something terrible? Then we are not having a death penalty conversation at all. We're having a revenge conversation. The real question is harder. After 34 years, after a divided 7-5 jury verdict, after a judge-only resentencing, after Hearst, after age, illness, sobriety, trauma, mitigation, the state knows this. After 34 years, does the state still have the moral authority to kill him? I say no, because death is different. I say no because 5 jurors said life was enough. I say no because no unanimous jury ever sentenced him to die. I say no because the Constitution now recognizes that Florida's old system was inadequate. I say no because timing should not decide who receives constitutional protection and who's carried into the execution chamber and strapped to a gurney. I say no because an elderly man who can be safely confined until natural death does not need to be killed to protect society. And I say no because once the state kills him, there is no correction, no consideration, no mercy, and no repair. The machinery simply moves on. The press simply continues to print warrants. And we continue to lose the benefit that people have to offer to society. The machinery moves on. And that's what Florida has become so efficient at doing. Moving on. One warrant after another. One execution date after another. One man after another. The language becomes routine. The press releases become routine. The denials become routine. The witnesses gather, the straps are tightened, the chemicals flow, the vigils start. The state calls it justice. But justice is not supposed to be routine. Killing should never become routine. We're normalizing killing people. A death warrant should never be treated like ordinary paperwork. And when a case carries this much constitutional doubt, this much moral weight, this much unanswered mitigation, the state should stop. They should simply stop. Not because Karen Spencer's life did not matter, not because the crime was not grave, but because the death penalty demands the highest reliability. And this case does not have it. Because mercy is not weakness. Because restraint is not disrespect for victims. And that's what Ron DeSantis says. It's why he does what he does. He does it for the victims. The victims don't get closure when an execution takes place. They've lived through decades of pain and suffering and misery every time something reminds them of this case. They don't get closure. Refusing to execute an elderly man under a constitutionally broken sentence does not dishonor Karen Spencer. It honors the principle that the state must not answer violence with a process that it already knows is flawed. We can hold two truths at the same time. Karen Spencer should still be alive, and Dusty Spencer should not be executed under this sentence. These truths do not cancel each other out. They make this case human. They break it down to its essence. They make it painful. They make it exactly the kind of case where conscience must do more than just rubber stamp the machinery of death. So tonight I'm asking for something simple. Stop this execution. Commute Dusty Spencer's sentence to life in prison without parole. Let him die in prison, if that's what the law requires. But do not kill him under a death sentence that was never unanimously imposed by a jury and that was later reimposed by a judge alone. Do not let finality become more important than fairness. Do not let timing become more important than the Constitution. Do not let vengeance become more important than truth. Do not let the state of Florida carry out an execution that future generations will look back on and ask, how did they know the system was broken and still let him kill this man? Don't let them do it. My name is Bill Kissinger, and I operate the Death Penalty Corner. I cannot continue to do what I do without your help. Please consider either subscribing as a paid or free subscriber, or go to buymeacoffee.com, Bill Kissinger, and contribute. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And let's hope that Dusty Ray Spencer lives. Thank you, and good night.